Okay, so now we're going to transition to talking about some language acquisition theories that try and help us understand the development of language for bilinguals who are learning more than one language at the same time, or are learning a second language sort of at a later time after they've learned a first. So the common underlying proficiency model of bilingualism was proposed by Jim Cummins. This should be sort of familiar to you based on your reading for this week. And it came about in the early 80s to explain how a bilingual's language and languages operates in thinking and learning. So this model, often represented as two icebergs, explains how concepts that are learned in one language can readily transfer into the other language. So a teacher trying to help her students understand how to multiply numbers in Spanish or how to use a dictionary in English can rely on the knowledge that the student may have learned about those two types of activities in their first language, right? The concepts specific to those activities are easily transferable from one language to the next because it's focused on multiplication, which is a skill, right? It's not language dependent. It's a skill that can transfer. Or how to use a dictionary, right? The way in which to find the words in the dictionary that you use, that you want to use. And also the way that a dictionary is written up. So notice that even though we've learned how to do math in probably English for most of us, that means that we can still do math even though somebody might be asking us the question in another language. Although we might not understand what they're asking us because of the language, the fact that we can add, multiply, divide, do those mathematical skills, those skills are transferable across languages. And we're going to look at how the skills of reading and literacy in general are also transferable to a certain degree. So a child does not have to be retaught to multiply numbers in English. A mathematical concept can be easily and immediately used in English or Spanish if those languages are sufficiently well developed. So in this model, you can see that the two icebergs are separate above the surface, above that line. So what that means is that the two languages are visibly different in outward conversation. But underneath the surface, right, sort of mentally, if we think about it, the two icebergs are fused so that the languages do not function separately. And what this is saying, this is Cummins' sort of theory, is that he's saying that the multiple languages that emergent bilingual students have operate through the same central processing system. They don't exist in separate sort of areas in the brain, right, where they're unrelated. In fact, all of that information is woven together in the mind, but when we speak, it comes out as one language or separate languages. Again, the different this model can be summarized as in both languages operate through the same central processing system. So, for example, the thoughts that accompany talking, reading, and writing, as well as listening, come from the same area, the same central engine. So when a person owns two or more languages, there is one integrated source of thought. The other piece is that bilingualism and multilingualism are very possible and actually very normal sort of ways for humans to develop and learn. And people have the capacity to store two or more languages in their minds. In some countries, depending on your environment, depending on how much exposure you have to one language or multiple, and also depending on how much opportunity you get to practice those languages and use them in interactions with others, you could learn up to 6, 7, 8 languages. In South Africa, as I think I may have said before, South Africa has 11 different languages that are recognized by the government, and depending on where you live, you are definitely going to be exposed to at least 3. So, for example, in Durban, where I grew up, I was exposed to English. I learned Afrikaans, and I also heard it out in the community. Afrikaans was something that I learned in school, and then Zulu was something also I learned in school, but I heard it very often in the community. And then on top of that, because of the heritage of my family, I also learned Italian. We also learned French in school. And so the ability for people to learn multiple languages is indeed very, very normal. Okay? And then the last piece, the most important piece that is really tied to this theory, Cummins theory, is that concepts learned in one language readily transfer into another language. And I'm going to give you an example. So when we've all learned to read at this point, and there are particular concepts around reading that we've had to learn step by step. So the fact that we are able to associate a sound to a symbol, right? So if we look at this letter here, right, we know that it's B, and that it's pronounced B or B, okay? So associating a sound with a symbol, then linking the symbols together, linking the sounds together, reading from left to right, right? Those are all concepts that we transfer, that we've learned, and that can be transferred to different languages. Spanish being one, because in this case, all of those different skills that I just pointed out about the sound of this letter, the fact that sounds link onto letters and that we put them together and read from left to right are all things that would be useful in Spanish too, or for English language learners would be useful from Spanish to English. Okay, Krashen's monitor model is another second language acquisition theory, and Krashen really believed that language is acquired and not learned by people of all ages. And by acquired, what he means is that one can study rules and grammar rules from a book up to a certain extent, but if it's not tried out, if it's not practiced, if it's not used by the person, then it's really limiting to how much a person can learn a language, right? The person really does need to try, practice, apply in sort of a spontaneous situation for language to be fully acquired and to and for it to be learned. Okay, so I'm going to lead you through this little model that Krashen came up with to describe the different aspects of this theory that he talked about. The first one you can see is comprehensible input. We start with there. And comprehensible input means that the language that is being used with the learner is at a level where they can understand, right? It's not something that is completely incomprehensible or completely at a higher level than what the student would be able to understand, right? So if an English language learner is at the beginning of learning English, in order for English to be comprehensible to them, the teacher would have to slow down the rate of speech. They would have to use pretty simple words. They would also have to use pretty simple syntax, right? You don't want to use a very complicated sentence. And those are the things that would make the language more comprehensible or at the level of comprehension of that student. Okay? So we start there with comprehensible input. The affective filter is something that Krashen described as sort of the emotions tied to learning a language. We know that as we get older, especially children going into sort of older student ages, learning a language and practicing it and making errors can be quite risky. And so there's a lot of social and emotional pieces tied to learning a language. So as long as the environment of the classroom is friendly, supportive, also encouraging of students to take risks to try and practice, then the affective filter will be open to allow that language, that learning to take place. So here you can see there's a dotted line, which means that the affective filter is open. The learning can sort of flow through those cracks, right? The comprehensible input. If the affective filter, if the environment is not supportive, not encouraging, sort of it doesn't really help students to take those risks, then what you'll see is that the effective filter would be picture closed, so there will be just a straight line, and that comprehensible input is not going to get through and not going to sort of be listened to by the student in order for learning to take place. So once that comprehensible input goes through, the effective filter is low, meaning that the student feels at ease and comfortable, sort of supported in that environment. It gets into the language acquisition device, which is that piece that Chomsky introduced as the part of us that is innate, right? That language learning ability that we're all born with as human beings. Here is where it's made sense, the grammar, right, the different rules implicitly that you're listening to and picking up in terms of patterns. And by processing that information, it becomes acquired knowledge. Now, notice how acquired knowledge is not something that has explicitly been taught to you. Okay? This is different than the rules that a teacher would write on the board and make you copy down, and exercises that you would do, sort of reinforcing the same grammatical piece of a language. No, that explicit training, explicit instruction is where language learning takes place. Language acquisition takes place when you are receiving comprehensible input and you're making sense of the grammatical patterns and trends yourself in your mind, right? That's where language acquisition takes place. The monitoring piece is talking about Krashen's aspect of the errors that students make and the attention that they pay to those errors to try and correct themselves, right? So as one is providing output, meaning speaking, right, using the language in different forms, maybe writing or speaking, they're going to make errors, which is completely natural in sort of the learning process. And by monitoring themselves, by paying attention to what they're saying and the errors that come out, they can then sort of modify or adjust their understanding of how those grammatical forms work to then correct themselves and to adjust that grammatical rule so that it's correct the next time that they would use it. Okay, so you can see that this is Krashen's monitor model, and all of those hypotheses that I just went through in this model are listed here for you. Okay, the only one that I haven't gone through is I+1. I+1 is connected to comprehensible input in that I being information plus 1, meaning at one level above, is the area that a teacher wants to teach in order to make sure that the student is always developing, always learning, right? If I were to just use the words and the syntax that you're familiar with in a language, that's not necessarily going to help you learn or take an additional step to learn aspects of the language that you don't know already. Okay, so that I+1 is what the level that the teacher wants to be in to make sure that students are continuously learning the language. Okay, so let's get into activity 2. Now that we've covered most of the second language acquisition theories, I'd like you to look through this list of 6 examples and try and think of all those different theories and which would apply here, right? So how are these examples representative of some of those theories? You can find this activity in the same unit where you're watching this video. In the activity section, you can click on it. It's a document. Feel free to pause the video at this point. Maybe you would like to rewind a little bit to remember the different theories. And then think about what theory the examples represent and be ready to sort of justify your answer around that. Okay, so let's go through the first one. Introducing new concepts by linking them to students' previous experiences with them. So this would be representative of nativism because in nativism, the Chomsky and other sort of psychologists were very interested and focused upon the prior knowledge that the child had learned and linking new information to that prior knowledge. So this is why when you are introducing new information as teachers, you always want to try and link it to the concepts that other teachers have that they've learned from other classes. Okay, so nativism would be guiding that particular instructional practice. Using positive responses when students answer questions correctly or incorrectly. Okay, so here this could be behaviorism because of the positive response, right? And that goes along with the stimuli response that behaviorism sort of taught us about. It also relates to Krashen's affective filter in that a teacher wants to use positive response to maintain a sort of a healthy and supportive emotional and social climate in a classroom, right? That positive climate in the classroom is going to be beneficial or help support learning for the student. Number 3, giving out a free homework pass to students who have completed their homework all week. Okay, so this would be an example of behaviorism again, and again, positive reinforcement particularly. Number 4, having students work in pairs and groups in which students need to collaborate. So here you should have said social interaction as the theory guiding this practice, and the reason is that by working in pairs and groups, the idea is that students are going to be able to negotiate that knowledge for themselves, and through that interaction, they might need help in a particular area, which would be provided by the students that they're interacting with and working with, and that in turn will help students to learn that information in a sort of in a better way. Number 5, commending students when asking a question as soon as they reach the right answer. So here would be an example again of behaviorism, which would be a positive stimulus with contiguity, because the teacher is being sure to commend the students as soon as they reach the right answer. So the teacher is really focusing on the lapse of time taking place between when a student does something right versus when the positive reinforcement is given. And number 6, build in a motivation piece at the beginning of class that helps students remember what was learned in a previous lesson. And this practice would be guided by nativism, which is very much focused on memory and trying to help students access the prior knowledge that they may have developed in other classes. And then my last question there is thinking about another way that you can sort of help yourself to contextualize these second language acquisition theories is to think of examples from your experiences in classrooms. Maybe you haven't done field experience observations up until now, but I'm sure you've spent some time in the classroom, either even as a student a couple years ago, or since then, if you've been in the classroom environment at all, you can think of some examples that would support or which originate from some of these different theories.